My name is Brekke Peterson. I have a PhD in agronomy with an emphasis in biogeochemistry and currently work for Agoro Carbon Alliance. Prior to this, I was a USDA federal soil scientist that worked in grasslands across the United States. Today, Dr. Gamiri asked me to speak on carbon markets because Agoro Carbon Alliance is a carbon crediting company that offers incentives to producers in row crop and grasslands across the United States and Brazil to implement soil health practices, management changes to build soil carbon. And we enroll producers, incentivize them to put in new practices, and then we pay them for their carbon credits that they store over time. And so my presentation today is essentially about Carbon Markets 101 and the practices in which Agoro offers. Little overview, like I said, we'll talk about Agoro Carbon, we'll talk about carbon markets, we'll talk about Agoro Carbon's project in particular here in the United States. We'll talk about specific practice descriptions and what sets us aside and what one should be looking for in the carbon market when we start looking for quality of carbon credits and how they're monitored. So if you haven't heard about Agoro Carbon Alliance through agricultural marketing or maybe on the radio or online, we are a company that was founded in June of 2021 by our parent company, Yara International, who is a leader in global fertilizer production. We came out of a forward-thinking project where Yara wanted to become more green, and they wanted to essentially shift some of the practices to more conservation practices as well as bettering soil health in the agricultural sector. They did this essentially through their own initiative of green ammonia production, and then they created Agoro. And we are essentially, they're part of their company that is utilized to decarbonize agriculture. And you can read more about that in Yara's website. There's lots of regenerative ag information. So carbon markets. Some of you guys might have heard about the Chicago Carbon Exchange that was around 15 to 25 years ago. It went defunct, essentially. But before we get there, we need to talk about what carbon markets actually are. And there are two different types of credits generated in the carbon market. There are carbon removal credits and carbon avoidance credits. And essentially removal credits are offsets, and this is essentially, they're generated from removing a practice from the landscape. So say you're not going to till for a year and people get paid for the greenhouse gases in which they're not producing and off-gassing to the atmosphere. That also being said, those are avoidance credits. Removal credits are actually storing of carbon in the ground as carbon storage as soil organic carbon. Avoidance credits are the short-term credits, and they're often not worth as much as removal credits. Agoro Carbon Alliance is actually in the removal credit sector. We pay producers for carbon credits that are generated off of carbon removal. So that being said, we're looking at taking carbon from the atmosphere, our carbon or CO2 equivalents, whether that be nitrogen or methane, storing them in the ground as monitorable SOC. The question about carbon markets is who's really interested in a carbon credit? People who are wanting to clean up their general lifestyle might pay attention to how much gas they're burning. They might walk more, they might get a bicycle, they might not travel as much. However, the people actually buying a lot of these offset credits are big business, and that would be individuals like Walmart, 3M, Gucci, Prada, Patagonia, Google. And essentially, these guys have not only internal needs or initiatives to decrease their carbon footprint, but in some places, if they are in the European Union or in other countries where it is mandated that they reduce their carbon footprint, they're looking for the ability to buy offset credits. Essentially right now, there is carbon reduction goals that are in excess of 25% of the global supply, which the voluntary market could actually provide. And Agoro's in the voluntary market. If you look to Europe, that's a cap and trade market, and so it is mandated. The U.S. is strictly carbon voluntary, so it is not mandated by the U.S. government as of yet. Essentially, 6% of the emissions of all the Fortune 500 companies exceeds currently the global supply of the credits that are available. So we need to start looking at ways to generate credits to meet this supply to reduce the carbon footprint of these large companies. And how do we do that? Well, back to that concept of the Chicago Exchange, there wasn't a universal method with the Chicago Exchange. Best way to think about it is if myself started a carbon company to sell carbon credits, I might monitor it one way and I might analyze my own samples, but I wouldn't be equivalent to, let's say, Joe, who has a company in Florida. He's utilizing a different methodology, he's sampling to a different depth, and nothing is universal. And so the carbon credits don't mean the same, they're not equivalent, and they're not worth the same. And often, if there's not rigor between what the program is that's storing that carbon, how that carbon is being monitored, and whether or not those acres in which that carbon is being stored is registered. Often these big companies are not interested in those carbon credits because they're not verified. Agoro Carbon utilizes Vera, which is an international registry firm that has very specific methodologies for agriculture. They also have agroforestry and other various methods for carbon reduction, but we utilize Vera. Specifically, we utilize methodology VM42, and this is essentially for the improvement of agricultural land management. Today, 95% of Agoro carbon credits are all nature-based removals. We are in the ag sector. We don't do anything concerning agroforestry at this juncture. And so essentially, we're kind of like the middleman. We set up the projects, we verify the carbon in the ground through third-party sampling and analysis from a producer. Then we take those lab results and our project that has been written go back to Vera, and they put their stamp of approval on the carbon credits that have been generated. So we have essentially two projects currently in the United States. We have the cropland or row crop program, and we also have the grassland pasture land program. And so we encompass all of agriculture in the United States except for the dairy at this juncture. We also have similar projects in the country of Brazil. So what are the exact opportunities when we start talking about our cropland or pasture land programs? Our cropland encompasses three legs, essentially. If you are a producer or have producers that might be interested in the carbon credit market, we would ask producers to look at their nitrogen management. Essentially, we want to reduce the greenhouse gases and increase the nitrogen use efficiency of the crop on the ground. We also look to reducing the number of tillage passes or going strictly to no-till in our program. This obviously reduces fuel expense and labor, as well as increases soil health. And we also look at the implementation of cover cropping in row crop scenarios. This can help reduce the need for fertilizer, reduce herbicide expense and erosion, as well as increase our soil health. When producers sign up with us, we've got essentially 18 agronomists currently across the United States that come out to acres, whether that be grassland or row crop, have very serious conversations with producers. We go across all of their production systems. We look at historical management data and find out what their goals are moving forward. Our contracts are 10 years long, so it is a commitment. That being said, producers can sign up for one of the row crop program management changes, or they can stack them. We've got individuals that are signed up for all three program management changes stacked up on acres. Currently, our contract minimum is 500 acres across the United States, but that's 500 acres total, not of one particular practice implementation. When it comes to our grassland pasture program, this is really neat. We're one of the very few carbon crediting companies in the United States that offer such a robust program. We look to essentially biodiversity, so interseeding another forage species that's beneficial to a rancher and their livestock. This could be something as simple as putting in more C3 or possibly more C4, depending on the seasonality or climate that your animals are grazing in. So you might have standing winter forage, or you might have a high protein forage during weaning or calving that could be very beneficial to your herd. The other benefit of increasing the plant biodiversity on acres is it can help reduce fertilizer costs, and it can increase the health of their animal. Also, as well as just general overall soil health from the microbial standpoint. We also look to improve or optimize rotational grazing. Conventional grazing is still very popular across the United States and makes people money. But the fact of the matter is rotational grazing has a major benefit on most acres in the United States. This can increase soil health. It can decrease weedy species. It can increase forage quality and forage abundance. And you also have the ability for timing and really be able to improve your overall forage yields on your production system by optimizing your grazing. We also utilize nitrogen management. And this is actually the use of N, because often, unless it's an irrigated or pasture production system strictly for hay, these acres are generally not afforded the ability for N management or N addition, simply because it's costly. But we help to upfront pay individuals to apply this N during our contract period to increase their forage base and jumpstart those microbial communities and increase the soil health while still storing carbon in the ground. And so more specifically, we're going to talk a little bit in depth about these particular options. It's really important that in our grassland projects that we do have animals on the ground. Animals are obviously herbivores, and they do a lot of grazing, which is really beneficial. They decrease residue size for decomposition purposes, add organic matter back into the system. When you utilize a rotational grazing system, you can decrease compaction in the soil and really increase the overall health of the system. And rotational grazing can also really benefit the overall animal health. But the big situation too is utilizing grazing in a pasture grassland range system can really help decrease your nuisance species overall. And so rotational grazing, I've only mentioned some of the overall benefits, but when we sign up producers at Agoro, we look to understand their current grazing scheme. And sometimes people are already sort of rotationally grazing. There's always the ability to make certain tweaks to grazing patterns. And we can do that through essentially altering of the stocking rate, decreasing pasture size, so creating paddocks. We also can change grazing days, increase rest days. One of the biggest improvements here is on yield and forage intake over time, and this is a result of that increased organic matter in the ground. Essentially, we've got the ability to sequester anywhere from 148 to 699 megatons per year of carbon in the ground just due to improved grazing globally, which is huge. From a biodiversity standpoint, this can mean a lot to producers because it increases their forage base. It adds biodiversity into their system so their soil health can increase, soil microbes increase, but it can also bring different invertebrates, pollinators in, bring in wildlife, so the system becomes biodiverse globally opposed to just via a plant population. This can really improve your yield, like I said, in carbon storage, but when you improve the types of forages on the ground, the animal health goes up. If you think about you as a human only eating chocolate brownies every single day of your life, one, you'd get bored, and two, you'd be overweight. And you'd eventually become very malnourished because you wouldn't be getting all of the nutrients you need. But if you add in, chicken breast to those chocolate brownies, you would start getting a much more full diet, and animals function the same way as does the soil. In our programs, we are not species specific, and we wrote the program that way because we have to encompass all of the United States. We're not just looking at dryland crops, and we're not, our forages. We're not just looking at alkaline tolerant forages. We have to encompass acres everywhere. And that being said, too, we also don't just focus on grass species. We also look at perennial legumes and other types of forages that can be beneficial to a system depending on what the rancher needs. Sometimes they need to increase their fiber. Sometimes they're looking for a different fatty acid profile to benefit their premium when they take animals to slaughter. The other situation, too, is sometimes they're looking simply to increase infiltration. So that can be the option of forage radishes and things like that to increase aeration in the ground and actually get moisture back into that system, which normally wouldn't be present. And this is a big deal. For CO2 equivalents in general, we can do 147 megatons per year just on biodiversity alone. There are producers who really only want to do native species on their ground, and that's very acceptable in our program. But we can tailor that native species to what they desire in their forage base. Obviously, when utilizing native seed, the cost per acre goes up considerably. If you're just looking at general forage species, people love crested wheatgrass in the West. It's great for drought tolerance, but it is not a native species, and when left to its own devices can take over. But it's very useful for animals in the long run and can show some biodiversity increase when needed. The other option in our grassland program is the use of nitrogen fertilizer. This can really jumpstart the system or prime the system from the microbial standpoint, as well as give those forages that are already present out there a huge start in the spring in particular. But the one caveat too here is we don't suggest that people utilize nitrogen-based fertilizers unless they have their annual weedy species cleaned up. Otherwise, those little nuisance individuals are going to take that nitrogen and take off, and the beneficial species will be competed out of the process. And so we essentially utilize nitrogen to increase that forage base and the overall yield. This essentially promotes that biomass growth and helps to store carbon. And the situation too is a lot of our acres that we have signed for grassland and pasture are west of the Mississippi. These are arid or semi-arid acres. And one of the big deals here is we don't necessarily want to put an ammonium nitrate-based fertilizer out there because it can hinder some of the soil microbes, particularly those that take up methane out of the atmosphere and store it into the ground. So in these more dry scenarios, we often say that a calcium nitrate fertilizer is a lot better than an ammonium nitrate, just to make sure that our methane-loving microbes are still doing their work to store methane in the ground, opposed to not doing anything and keeping it in the atmosphere. Nitrogen-based fertilizers on grass and pasture alone can do 0.8 of a megagram per acre per year, which is still quite beneficial when you look at our overall acreage in the United States. When it comes to our row crops, this originally was where Agoro wanted to start and thought that this would be really the bread and butter of the carbon market. Row crop, there's a lot of acres and there's a lot of ways we can alter the overall carbon use or carbon storage in these systems, but the ability to store at great rates or great amounts is a lot less in row crop than it is in arid grassland systems. Like I had mentioned, in row crop programs, we offer tillage reduction, cover cropping, and nitrogen management for our three practice management types for row crop acres under contract. Tillage reduction can mean lots of different things, like I had mentioned. We do have individuals that are signing up that go from conventional to true no-till. We have individuals that go from conventional more to a conservation tillage, and we have individuals that are conservation that go to no-till. So we can sign up acres across the board. The only one we cannot sign up is actual no-till acres, and that's because of additionality. And we have to show a change in the production system in order for Vera to approve those acres. And if there is no actual practice change, they don't approve those acres. So we deal with additionality quite often, which sadly causes our historic no-tillers or historic cover croppers who've been doing the proper soil practices for the last 20 years, currently unable to enter into the carbon markets. But essentially with tillage reduction, we're reducing the loss of existing carbon. We're also promoting residue decomposition and storage of that carbon in the ground. And we're also increasing or not decreasing the current microbial diversity due to disturbance. And we've got short-term and long-term benefits essentially associated with tillage. That can be soil health improvement, crop resiliency, lots of ecological benefits, and there are markets associated with those ecological benefits for carbon markets. We have the ability to reduce costs to the overall production system, increase yields, and also increase nutrient availability. For cover cropping, this essentially adds more carbon into the in the form of plant biomass into the soil. We alter the rooting zone structure, which can mean we're mining nutrients from different levels opposed from the same level year after year after year. And this also promotes microbial diversity. Cover cropping is not limited in our program. Cover crop essentially is covering your bare ground after harvest, essentially. You can utilize a legume, you can utilize a cereal, you can use a brassica, you can use a cocktail of different species if you would like, depending on what your desired goals are. Our agronomists help to tailor that to each producer that signs up with our program. But there are multiple benefits to cover cropping. Obviously, your soil media isn't blowing away because it is covered. You can have this increased microbial biodiversity, which is important to decomposition and carbon storage overall. It has a major benefit to breaking pathogen cycles within cash crops, and just overall benefit of the system, as well as native species in terms of pollinators and wildlife can really benefit from cover crops. Once again, we have many of the same long-term and short-term benefits that you saw in tillage. Then we have nitrogen management, and nitrogen management is really important in the large commodity crops, particularly corn. We utilize a lot of nitrogen in the Midwest for corn production. What we're looking at is optimizing the use of chemical fertilizer, whether that be multiple applications throughout a year opposed to just one large application. We want to reduce the loss of N, and essentially nitrogen management also saves money in the long run. This can essentially improve our soil health, really increase our ecological benefits, but overall really can change the structure of our soil and help to store more carbon, which is really beneficial because more of the natural feedback systems start to come back into play because the chemical fertilizer is no longer relied upon. And this is generally done in corn soybean rotations, and we see benefit here. Similar to the long and short-term benefits we talked about before. So we've got example of farm benefits. These are a big deal because if you base just general pricing on certain things, producers can make a lot of money per year, depending on how this is set up. We essentially have two payment opportunities that when you stack practices, you essentially can accrue more money through Agoro. And we come to the situation of making sure that our carbon credits are quality. So we have our grassland, we have our cropland program throughout the United States, but we have done all of our due diligence when it comes to the carbon market. Agoro actually sort of started backwards when you think about starting up a business. We went directly to the buyers like 3M and Walmart and said, if we could create actual carbon credits in agriculture, what would you want them to look like? And the individuals, the buyers said, well, we want them to be third-party verified. We want money to go back to your producers, and we want permanence in your contracts, and we also want to see that there's additionality. And so one of our questions was, well, if you want these to be registered credits or verified credits, who do you think is the best out there? Gold Standard and Vera both popped up. We originally looked at Gold Standard, and we would have originally gone with them. They're very healthy and very beneficial toward agroforestry, but Agoro Carbon is not in the agroforestry business. We are in the agricultural business of grasslands and row crops. Hence the reason we went with Vera, because they had methodology that was ready to go for us. And so we went with Vera. Vera requires that we have third-party soil samplers, third-party analyses. We do get the data. They have very specific ways of us calculating credits. We can either do measure and remeasure, we can do measure and model, or we can strictly model. Agoro Carbon does measure and model. When it comes to measure and model, we measure originally at baseline year 0, again at year 5, and at the end of the 10-year cycle of our contract. And we pay for the changes of carbon within there. We have 2 payment structures, essentially. One that is front-loaded payments, 0 to year 5 for producers to help implement rotational grazing or buy seed. Look at buying new implements for reduced tillage, or looking at buying seed for cover cropping. Also looking to buy nitrogen for those grassland acres. And then we pay for the difference, essentially, that's left over at year 5. And then we pay again at the end of the 10-year cycle for what they accrued. We have the pay for performance method too, where we don't front load any money to our producers. All we simply do is we go out, take a baseline sample. We still model this, and then we go out and take a year 5 sample and reassess what has happened and pay on the difference. We always measure and remodel in the United States, and we sample from the West Coast to the East Coast. And the sampling scenario is all stratified via SOC topography, as well as other indices. That being said, we also, because it's required by Vera, sample down to a minimum of 30 centimeters for SOC. We also take paired bulk density samples with that SOC for proper volume calculations. One of the big things that was always an issue with the carbon exchange 20 years ago was there wasn't third-party involvement. That's probably the one thing, leaving a laboratory setting, that I miss the most in this role, because I'm no longer in the field taking samples on a regular basis and analyzing them, because I can't, because that makes our credits less valuable in the long run. We utilize reputable labs across the United States, and then we do this 3 times over the contract period. And if need be, we do sample more. This essentially helps us to ensure that we have a quality credits and that we have that permanence associated with what our buyers want, hence our 10-year contract. We also take a lot of historical management data so that we can prove to Vera that there is additionality within our acres that are signed. And we have to show that practice change. Essentially, when you think about management systems, particularly those that have grazing animals on the landscape, we can accrue essentially 1.9 picogram of carbon per year until equilibrium is achieved, which is quite a bit. This is essentially, if you put that on a day-to-day scale, that's the equivalent of emissions of 432 million passenger cars a year. So we would be making a huge change just by having those animals on the landscape, aside from changes in row crop production systems. And so why is this such a big deal in agriculture right now? Well, one, we have looming climate issues that we all experience on a regular basis. Our producers that are making the food we eat and rely upon are looking to diversify. Particularly in row crop scenarios, there's a lot more incentives associated with row crops than there are ranching acres. This is a huge program in the ranching lifestyle because it provides money to ranchers who normally wouldn't have backup income to implement practices or get water to other parts of their fields, possibly get new genetics to their herds. So we're providing a new income stream for ranching and farming production systems. And this is also while reducing emissions and capturing soil carbon. So we're helping to implement long-term soil health changes. We are essentially a verified carbon solution for business. We are the middleman, so we can help large business help to offset their carbon footprint overall. And essentially, because we're storing carbon in the ground through long-term management practice change, we are looking at the potential of this being a permanent scenario. One of the big things that Agoro is constantly doing is looking at up-and-coming research and conducting research to look at more permanent ways to help store carbon in the ground and promote new practices within the agricultural world for carbon production while expanding our portfolio of offerings. I want to thank everybody for listening about the talk today. You can always reach out to agorocarbonalliance.com to learn more about Agoro Carbon. My contact information is up there if you have any questions whatsoever. I'm based out of northern Wyoming. We have agronomists and regional sales individuals all over the United States and throughout Brazil, like I mentioned. Essentially, one of the big things about Agoro is not only is there a lot of face-to-face contact with your agronomist and the producer, but we're essentially offering a lot of free agronomic help to producers that they might normally have to pay for or might not necessarily be available in their regions. We also cover all the costs of soil sampling as well as sharing that information with our producers. But thank you all for your time.